So I am Alison Brooks, and I am a professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I'm also part of the Human Origins program at the Smithsonian. And I'm going to talk about when do we see the beginning of what we could call some of these tribal organizations, of large-scale human organizations that operate for better or for worse against other large-scale organizations. And I think that we've begun to explore this. This is a picture. Just a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm an archaeologist, but I've also worked both with Dr. Wiesner, who just spoke, and with my husband and a large team of other people in the Kalahari with the Jinkwasi, hunter-gatherers when we came. And they have a very different organization, not a tribe, as we would call it. Then I've worked in about 7 other African countries doing archaeology among tribal people, non-tribal people, hunter-gatherers, and so on. So I'm a little bit of a social anthropologist and a little bit looking at what we can say about the past from the very minimal remains we find in these sites. So as Polly has explained to us, we ask a question, what is a tribe? Anthropologists originally defined tribes as a level of human organization beyond the face-to-face group or the kin-based clan, which can be a subset of a tribe, but they're often less extensive, complex, or multi-ethnic than nations. Most nations involved or subsumed several tribes. Think of Italy or Gaul as divided into 3 parts or whatever, that many of our modern nations were once collections of tribes who spoke different languages and had different customs. A tribe is one of the many imagined communities. That is, in many cases, it exists in our heads, and as much as it has a reality on the ground, and that sense of who is a tribe and how far the tribe extends is reified by symbols. Those symbols can be what you wear, it can be how you speak and what kind of accent. Even if you speak the same ostensible language, it can be the accent that you use to speak it. It can be your gestures, your body ornaments, your body modifications, whether you knock your front teeth out or wear tattoos or whatever. The ritual practices that bind adolescents together in initiation, the burial practices, the shared origin stories, and the shared speech, and so forth. Tribes are potential platforms for corporate action, including warfare, raiding, territorial expansion, adoption of new technologies like farming or fishing, and practices. The membership of tribes is interesting. It's according to kinship and descent rules, and whether you've been through the ceremonial rite of passage. But the descent rules often prioritize one gender over another. So that in Botswana, where I worked for many years, it is said by the dominant Swana majority that women have no tribe, because women marry out of the tribe into either other groups of the same tribe or often other tribes. So women have a less strong attachment to the tribe that they grew up in than men do. And leadership can be hereditary in a tribe or charismatic. The best warrior wins. It can be democratic or autocratic. It can be individual or corporate. And when I worked among the Jinkwasi in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, was it a tribe? And Polly and I agreed that it wasn't a tribe because the living groups were very small, but they all had large individual networks. The relationships of people to each other were individual. They weren't corporate. The minimal group of people who lived together throughout the year was 25, usually a few adults and maybe 6 to 10 children. But when the weather dried up and there were very few water points, about 120 people might live together for a few months. The thing was, though, that every year if you took a census of the people living around the waterhole, 50% of them were different. And what was the main fundamental organization tying people together across space were these networks of partners. Some of them were kin partners, some of them were marriage partners, some of them were just exchange partners. You wanted to have as many partners as possible, so when the weather went bad where you are, you had an excuse to go move in with somebody else. And obviously that's not going to work if everybody goes and moves in with the same person. Then that person pretty soon has nothing to eat. But it would allow people to redistribute themselves across the landscape in a bad year. So these networks were your capital against bad times. And this work on networks was Polly's work who just spoke to us about Enga, was fundamental in establishing how important these were. What I was always interested in her study is the size of your network grew into middle age. Because then in your middle age, you're the sandwich generation. You're supporting your parents, you're supporting your kids, and you need a big network if anything goes bad. But then when you get old, you start pruning your network. It isn't worth putting that kind of effort into exchanging gifts with all those people, keeping up with all those people. It's like pruning your Christmas card list. And the leadership of such a flexible society was largely situational. And it was based on consensus. Women had pretty much an equivalent voice to men, and there were some situations where there was warfare under a leader, but they were very rare. And we have to ask, are we, despite the fact that many of the hunter-gatherer societies we study are not organized like tribes, are we nevertheless inherently able to do this? Are we inherently hypersocial and tribal? And if so, when did it begin? So as putting on my archaeology hat, what do we look for in the record of the past to tell us that some kind of larger scale human society is forming? We look for an ability to transcend the local. And the clearest evidence of this is when we see long-range intergroup contacts, where people are clearly moving across the landscape in greater distances than we see in a typical home range of a band society. And this contact is represented in archaeology by the movement of raw material from distant sources. So these imply the existence of networks. We also look for the existence of symbols, whether those symbols are on the landscape, in caves, or in utilitarian objects that are similar across space, or personal ornaments, what kind of beads you wear. I tell my students that the university I work at is on the same street as the World Bank. So I tell my students, well, can you tell when you get up in the morning and go to class who's a banker and who's a professor? And you certainly can, because the bankers are not dressed like the professors, most of them anyway. But the use of dress, personal ornaments, pigments to signal identity and status are very common in enabling people to recognize each other across space as a friend. And these are communities linked by common symbols and technological practices. So they might all make the same kind of arrowhead, or they might all make the same kind of house. And this implies some kind of cultural transmission across space. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at evidence of long-distance movement of people reflected in their material culture. So when do we begin to see this? Well, we do have already symbolic behavior and social intensification 90 to 60,000 years ago across large areas of Africa, from South Africa, Namibia in the south, to East Africa, in Tanzania and Ethiopia, to Morocco and Algeria in the north. And these imply that humans had fully human social formations and very likely fully human language. The context is an archaeological stage we call the Middle Stone Age, and we see things like this little piece of decorated ochre in the upper left, the beads on the right, which are all made of the same genus of shell that lives in an estuary on the South African coast. And all of those shells have string wear in them that enables you to tell how they were worn. And they also have red ochre from rubbing against the body of somebody who was wearing a lot of ochre. Then the things at the bottom are bits of ostrich eggshell canteens, which have 15 or 16 different kinds of decorative motifs on them. And similar canteens in the Kalahari, like the one in the middle, denote regional identity, regional kinds of symbols of who made them. When do we begin to see the transport of exotic stone and shell in the Middle Stone Age? Do we see it earlier? At 77 to 80,000 years, a rock called Silkrete was transported 150 kilometers across the Kalahari. At Aduma, Ethiopia, where we worked with Dr. Tim White in the 1990s, many of the points and other tools are made from obsidian. At least 8 sources of obsidian were identified chemically, and none of them are in the local area. That's about 90,000 years ago. Then in Algeria, those shell beads I just showed you from South Africa, exactly the same shell genus shows up in Algeria at 82,000 years ago, at least 40 kilometers inland. Those shells don't grow 40 kilometers inland. They grow on the coast. So not only is it long-distance transport, it's also long-distance transport of a symbol of a personal ornament. And we also have the same shell beads in Israel at 105,000. At 200,000, in a site in central Kenya, 43% of the artifacts are made of obsidian, a especially sharp, glassy stone that sometimes is used in surgery in the United States because it's so sharp. It's sharper than steel, and it can cut between cells. You heal much faster from a surgical operation with an obsidian blade than you might with a steel scalpel. But it's a very valuable stone because of the sharpness of the edge. And 43% of the artifacts at this site in central Kenya at 200,000 years ago were from 166 kilometers away, which is long-distance transport by any definition. Okay, the fossils associated with the Middle Stone Age are all Homo sapiens, from South Africa, from Ethiopia, this one published by Haile Selassie, Johannes, and Tim White on the right. But Homo sapiens in the Middle Stone Age are even older. There's a modern human fossil in Greece now at 210,000 that was just published. There are, a year ago, new fossils, artifacts, and dates were published from Morocco, Homo sapiens, Middle Stone Age. And then what we also find is that when modern humans show up in Europe and start making cave paintings and so forth, we also have those very similar paintings in Namibia and in Indonesia. So it seems to have been an ability to represent our culture and our identity in symbols and images of things that are often mythical, like a person with a lion head, that this is fundamental to us. So this is from a paper that I wrote with Sally McBrearty in the early 2000s. And this is what we thought about what Middle Stone Age people could do and the timeline along the bottom. But what we see is that many of these activities, like long-distance exchange in the last 10 years, have been extended much further back in time. Also that Homo sapiens, we thought the oldest one was maybe 260,000 years, a few years ago. But now we know that the long-distance exchange, the beads, the points, the pigment processing of ochre and other pigments goes way back beyond 300,000, as does Homo sapiens, the most recent fossil of Jebel Irhoud on the right. Okay, so I'd like to talk very briefly about New Middle Stone Age at Olorgesailie in Kenya, where John, my husband, and I have been working with Rick Potts of the Smithsonian and a whole host of collaborators for about the last 18 years. And here we're particularly interested in sites that are around 320 to 220,000 years old. So they're older than anything else I've talked about already. So we've excavated this series of sites, and what we find is many of them have some obsidian. One of them has a tremendous amount of obsidian. And this is one of the oldest ones at 320,000. So this is just a screenshot of the site with a horse tooth in the middle and a bunch of obsidian flakes all around. And 42% of the plotted artifacts, there are 5,700 plotted artifacts, but we also have 45,000 small flakes of obsidian. All of this obsidian is non-local. There is no obsidian in the immediate area. And they're also making the artifacts on site. Here's a core, and here's a little point that came off the core. So we know that and all those little chips, we know that they're making they're bringing the obsidian in, and they're transforming it into artifacts there. Where did they get the obsidian from? It's not from the local area. So working with Stanley Ambrose, the University of Illinois, he surveyed a lot of different sources in the area, and we characterized them chemically with multiple techniques and discovered, that I think I lost a slide in here, but there is a map. The question is, what do we mean by local? And these are maps that John Yellen and Richard Lee and others drew of where people in a hunting-gathering band move in a year. And the diameter of most of those little irregular circles is not over 30 kilometers. So anybody who's regularly moving more than 30 kilometers in this environment is probably going into somebody else's territory. Here's our map of obsidian sources. We were very fortunate to find out from all the people doing environmental work on our project and on the sites we were digging that actually the closest analog to what these sites looked like 320,000 years ago is quite by accident the northern Kalahari. Same animals, same trees, same bushes. And so we don't feel we're stretching a point when we look at the home range size in the Kalahari and the home range size here. So there's a scale at the bottom of 40 kilometers, and you'll notice that some of these sites are within 30, some of them are 40, some of them are 70, some of them are 105 kilometers away. These are not local trips. And each level of the sites that we dug have multiple different sources being accessed. So people are really moving very far over the landscape. So how do you maintain a large social network and allow strangers to interact? What we also found in the same time range in other sites is in the same area is pigment that had been worked. This is some of the earliest work pigment in the world, and this goes along with a new emphasis on exotic raw materials. This is a semi-perforated block of ochre. We also had manganese nodules at another site, and this ochre had been semi-perforated and also ground. So here's a picture of the grinding striations, and we thought the holes might be natural, but when we looked at them under the kind of microscope that has a deep depth of field, we found that somebody had actually chopped out the holes with a straight-edged object. So these are not holes that just happened. They are holes that were deliberately made to get a powder out that could be then applied to the body or something to indicate identity. So the last question I'd like to turn to is an argument that's made by some anthropologists that once you have large-scale social formations like tribes or clans, it leads inevitably to larger-scale collaborative action, and particularly larger-scale violent action such as warfare. First of all, I should say that personal aggression is very ancient in humans. There are fossils in the past with dents in their heads from being hit. There's a fossil I'll show you in a minute that has a knife wound in his back. And there's no evidence that that's mass aggression. When hunter-gatherers fight, the fighting tends to be resolved, even if it involves more than one person, by the protagonists in the fight splitting up and moving away at least for a time. That obviously only works if you have somewhere to go. And fossil humans, as I mentioned, bear evidence of blunt force trauma and also cannibalism. So here's a Neanderthal from Iraqi Kurdistan, interestingly, who had a knife wound. That's his left side rib there, with a very clear wound from a stone knife, and that probably didn't heal very well, and he probably died of. There's no sign of very, very extensive healing in that cut. That's like, being stabbed on the left side is going to kind of do you in. But then when we get to 18,000 to 10,000 years ago, so we have this dribble of individual aggressions throughout human history, get to 18 to 10,000 years ago, this is a period of dramatic climate fluctuation at the end of the Pleistocene. We have environments that have filled up in the interim to the carrying capacity of the environment, and then suddenly it's the last big period of global warming. The oceans rise, they drown land that people depended on. The deserts, some of them expand, but in any case, there are too many people in those arid areas to be sustained when the climate is fluctuating. And so we find burials with obvious signs of trauma. So this individual from Egypt, not only did he have a healed parifracture on his right ulna. Parifracture is when you put up your arm to prevent somebody hitting you, and they hit you anyway and break your arm. The left arm had a stone chip in his humerus, and his abdominal cavity had 2 stone bladelets in it. So probably this individual was murdered or killed. But then when we turn to the Sudan, that's 18,000, turn to the Sudan at 10,000 years ago, which is a dry area that's particularly susceptible to these things. 40%, this is a cemetery with several dozen individuals, 40% of them died of violent death. So all the pencils in the picture of the people in the lower right point to arrowheads in their bodies, and about half of these individuals are women. This is not warfare that's taking place between men. This is kill all the people warfare. Nataruk in Kenya was published last year. This is a massacre site in Kenya about 10,000 years ago around Lake Turkana. 27 individuals. Again, 8 of them are male, 8 of them are female, 5 of them are so bashed up you can't tell, and 6 of them were children. All but 2 of these individuals have evidence of some kind of trauma before they died. This individual has a stone point embedded in his head, and many others have arrow points, often in the body cavities. So this is another site besides Jebel Sahaba where a lot of people seem to have died at more or less the same time and from a violent end. But then when my colleague Susan Pfeiffer has been studying the remains of individuals on the south coast of South Africa for many years, and what's really shocking is the amount of violence against children. All of these are children's skulls and that have been perforated by somebody with a spear or a digging stick or something, and there's no healing on the edges of all these wounds. Here's another individual who's been stabbed in the head, a child, and again, that head wound has not healed in the slightest. This individual certainly did not survive. So you have to ask, at what point is this warfare in the sense of marauding armies against each other, or just a group of people who have to wipe out the other guys in order to survive? Here's another individual who had arrows in his, 2 arrows, as you can see, in the back of his, in the middle of the thoracic vertebrae. So again, another violent death. There are lots and lots of these skeletons with violent deaths. So my conclusions are that network organization over long distances and the use of pigment in the Middle Stone Age implies that recognizably human societies are more than 300,000 years old. And this ability to use symbols to cross lines is part of our DNA. It is roughly coincides with the earliest dates for our species there and elsewhere. So all humans have the potential to develop more formal tribes, but only some do so. But the ability to form large interacting social groups does not necessarily lead to warfare, nor is warfare limited to societies with capital, like farmers or herders or fishing settlements. But warfare is especially common worldwide when climate change imposes resource stress, whether it's drought, whether it's mini ice ages, or global warming, such as we are facing in our future. So this is a cautionary tale to think about the most vulnerable parts of the world where the population has been rising for many tens of years. The world population has tripled in my lifetime. And we have to recognize that global warming is not just about losing the coastal cities. It's about something more serious. Okay, so I'd like to thank all of the people that we've worked with over many, many years to begin to develop this picture. So thank you very much for your attention. And